The cruelest punishment you can give someone who took you for granted is not anger. It's not confrontation. It's not even revenge. Those things still keep you tethered. They still prove you care. The real punishment is absence. Total absence. No warning, no explanation, no dramatic exit speech. You don't slam the door. You don't announce your departure. You simply vanish. And the moment you do, something begins to unravel inside their mind that they will never confess to you out loud. Because absence doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate, it doesn't explain itself. Absence forces the mind to speak to itself, and that internal dialogue is far more brutal than anything you could ever say. People assume power comes from presence, from visibility, from being heard. But long before modern psychology ever named it, Machiavelli understood something colder and more precise. Power comes from control over perception, and nothing destabilizes perception faster than the sudden removal of someone who is assumed to be permanent. When you disappear, you don't just leave a space behind. You erase a certainty. You remove a pillar from the architecture of their inner world, and the first thing they feel is not sadness. It's not regret. It's confusion. This is the shock of non-existence. You see, people rarely value you for who you are while you're there. They value the reliability of your presence. The consistency of your attention. The predictability of your emotional availability. Over time, you become a fixed variable in their reality. And fixed variables are not respected. They are expected. You answered when they reached out. You absorbed their chaos. You stayed accessible, and without realizing it, they built their emotional routines around you. Not consciously, habitually. Like furniture in a room they stopped noticing. Then one day, the furniture is gone. Not moved, not replaced. Gone. Their mind reaches for you automatically. They check their phone. They open the chat. There's a moment where they expect your name to appear, where their body still believes you're reachable. And when nothing happens, something inside them misfires. This isn't grief yet. This is disorientation. It's like walking into your kitchen in the dark and reaching for the refrigerator, only to touch empty air. Your body knows something is wrong before your mind catches up. The system they've been running crashes because one of its core assumptions has been violated. You were supposed to be there. Machiavelli observed that people are ruled not by foresight, but by immediate needs. They assume continuity. They assume tomorrow will look like yesterday, and when that assumption collapses, panic doesn't arrive all at once. It leaks in through small moments. An unanswered message, an empty seat, a name that no longer appears. The silence doesn't shout. It hums, and that frequency follows them everywhere. At first, they don't frame it as loss. They frame it as a glitch. Surely you'll respond later. Surely something came up. Surely this is temporary. Their mind resists the truth because the truth demands accountability. And this is where the second mechanism quietly activates. The internal interrogation. Once the shock settles, the questions begin. Not clean questions, not logical ones. Fragmented, obsessive, looping questions that arrive at inconvenient hours. 2 a.m, mid-conversation. In moments where distractions fall away. What happened? Did I do something? Why aren't they responding? Are they upset? Are they done with me? Their mind turns into a courtroom where they are both the prosecutor and the defendant. They replay conversations. They revisit moments they dismissed. Times they chose convenience over consideration. And beneath all of it, a realization starts to form that they were never prepared for. They weren't ready for you to have limits. You were supposed to be infinite. A bottomless well they could return to whenever they needed validation, attention, or stability. But wells that are never replenished run dry. And now they're staring into an empty hole, trying to remember when it happened, how it happened, why they didn't notice. This interrogation has no verdict, no closure, no gavel to end the session. It loops endlessly because there is no external answer coming to save them. Machiavelli once noted that you can measure a ruler by the people around him. But what happens when a ruler wakes up and the court is empty? When the throne room echoes? When the silence reflects only their own footsteps? Doubt creeps in, not loudly, and that doubt has a direction, because the mind cannot tolerate emptiness for long. It demands resolution. It craves an ending to every story. And when you deny it that ending, when you leave the loop open, something far more powerful than anger takes hold. Hunger. Not hunger for you necessarily. Hunger for explanation. Hunger for meaning. Hunger to close the file and regain control. They begin searching not for you, but for fragments. Social media, old messages, mutual acquaintances, any scrap of information that might explain your disappearance. And here, without lifting a finger, the power shifts. Every unanswered question becomes a hook. Every missing explanation deepens the obsession. The less you give, the more their mind supplies. And what they supply is rarely kind to them. Because absence does something presence never could. It forces self-examination. And this is only the beginning. What comes next is not confusion, but construction. Not silence, but stories. Not absence, but a version of you they will invent to survive the void you left behind. And once that process begins, there is no way back to how things were. When the mind cannot tolerate uncertainty any longer, it does what it has always done best. It fills the void, not with truth, but with stories. This is the moment where absence stops being empty and starts becoming dangerous. This is the phase of myth-making. Understand this clearly. People do not invent narratives to understand you. They invent narratives to protect themselves. Truth threatens the ego. Silence threatens identity. And when both collide, the mind chooses survival over accuracy. They begin rewriting history. Maybe you were always distant. Maybe you were unstable. Maybe you never cared as much as they thought. Maybe you're doing this for attention. Maybe you'll come back eventually. These stories are not random. Each one serves a function. Each one shields them from the single conclusion their psyche cannot yet accept. That they misjudged you, underpriced you, and lost something valuable through neglect. Admitting that would require ownership. And ownership requires pain, so instead, they mythologize. Machiavelli understood this mechanism intuitively. He observed that people judge more by appearances than by reality, because appearances are easier to manipulate. And when reality disappears entirely, when you remove yourself from view, the imagination becomes king. Here's the irony. The less you engage, the more mental labor they must perform to keep their internal story intact. Every contradiction forces a revision. Every unanswered question demands an explanation. You are no longer a person in their life. You are a psychological project, and projects drain energy. They will defend these myths publicly. They'll tell friends they're better off, that it was mutual, that you were never that important. Not because they believe it fully, but because saying it out loud helps stabilize the illusion. But illusions require maintenance. Late at night when no one is watching, when the distractions wear thin, the myth begins to crack. The story doesn't quite line up with the feeling. If you are so insignificant, why does your absence still echo? If you didn't matter, why does the silence still sting? That question leads directly into the next phase. The phantom presence. There is a psychological phenomenon where the mind involuntarily recalls someone it claims to be over. Not deliberately, not nostalgically, intrusively. A face in a crowd, a voice in another room, a song that lands too close. You become everywhere and nowhere at once. This is not romantic. This is destabilizing. Because it arrives after they thought they had moved on, after the shock, after the interrogation, after the myths. Just when they believe they've regained control, your absence reasserts itself in fragments. A smell, a phrase, a place. And suddenly, the story collapses again. Machiavelli wrote extensively about timing, about knowing when to act and when to withdraw. What he understood, though rarely stated explicitly, is that withdrawal creates a vacuum, and vacuums demand to be filled. They try, with distractions, with noise, with new people, with movement. But nothing quite fits the shape you left behind, because the space wasn't just emotional, it was structural. You occupied a role in their internal economy, and now that role is empty. This is where the presence becomes cruel, because it's uncontrollable. They cannot decide when you appear in their thoughts. They cannot schedule forgetting. They cannot shut it off. The mind hates losing autonomy, and when autonomy slips, value recalculates. Every human being operates on an internal ledger. An unconscious accounting system that tracks who matters, who doesn't, who deserves attention, who can be ignored. While you were present, you were abundant, accessible, reliable, cheap. But scarcity changes markets. This is the revaluation crisis. In your absence, the ledger is forced to update, and the update is painful because it reveals an error. Not yours, theirs. They assigned you the wrong value, not because you lacked worth, but because familiarity blinded them. Now the correction comes through loss. They see it clearly. The patience, the stability, the way you showed up, the way you absorbed without complaint. And with that clarity comes something far heavier than regret. Admission. Machiavelli observed that people rarely recognize their mistakes until correction is no longer possible. And by the time this realization lands, the market is closed. You're no longer available. Your presence is no longer for sale. They can see your value now, but they cannot access it. This is where regret stops being sharp and becomes dense. Chronic. A low-grade ache that settles in. Because it's one thing to lose something valuable. It's another thing to realize you discarded it slowly, casually, without malice, through neglect. Neglect is quiet. That's what makes it lethal. And now, with the myths exhausted, the phantom unresolved, and the value recalculated too late, there is only one place left for the mind to turn, inward. This is where the mirror appears, not the flattering one, not the one that explains away behavior, the one that doesn't lie. They stop asking what happened to you. They start asking what's wrong with them. Why do people leave? Why does this keep happening? Why does no one stay? Your absence becomes a reflection, and the image staring back is not kind. It suggests a pattern, a common denominator, a truth they've avoided for years. Some will look away, retreat back into myth, find someone new to repeat the cycle with. Change requires courage, and courage demands suffering. But some will stare too long, and in that stare, something cracks. Not into destruction, into openings. You won't be there to see it. You've already moved on. But somewhere deep in their psyche, your absence will remain etched, not as anger, not as resentment, as proof. Proof that they once had something real and didn't know how to hold it. And what comes after that realization is the final transformation, the one that determines whether your disappearance becomes a lesson or a permanent scar. After the mirror, there is a stillness, a pause, a moment where the mind stops running and simply sits with what it has uncovered. This is where most people think the process ends. It doesn't. This is where it becomes irreversible. Because now the question is no longer about you, it's about power. Up to this point, your disappearance has been something that happened to them, an event, a disruption. But in this phase, it becomes something they must explain in relation to themselves. And that distinction changes everything. They begin to sense that your absence is not accidental, not emotional, not impulsive. It carries intention, and intention implies agency. Agency implies control. That realization is destabilizing. Machiavelli understood that the deepest fear is not loss, but displacement. The fear that someone you thought you had influence over has removed themselves from your reach, that the dynamic has inverted without confrontation, without permission. You didn't argue, you didn't demand, you didn't negotiate. You simply exited the board. And that exit reframes the entire relationship retroactively. Every moment of dismissiveness, every assumption, every time they delayed, minimized, or deprioritized you now reappears in a different light, not as dominance, as miscalculation. This is where their narrative collapses completely, because there is no story that protects the ego from someone who walked away cleanly. Anger can be rationalized. Conflict can be reframed. But composure, silence, finality without explanation, that cannot be dismissed without admitting something fundamental. You had leverage, and you chose not to spend it. This is the point where they feel the weight of what Machiavelli would call strategic loss. Not the loss of a person, but the loss of position. You were part of their emotional terrain, a known quantity, a controllable variable. Now you are outside the map, and what is outside the map is feared. Your absence becomes elevated in their mind, not because you exaggerated yourself, but because the mind fills empty space with significance. When no new information arrives, the imagination inflates what it already has. You become cleaner in memory, sharper, more composed, less flawed. Arguments fade, tensions blur. What remains is essence. And essence, unchallenged by reality, becomes idealized. This is not nostalgia. This is perception distortion. Machiavelli warned that people do not respond to truth as it is, but to truth as it appears. And when all that appears is silence, the mind constructs meaning at scale. They begin to wonder if they misread you entirely, if the power dynamic was never what they assumed, if you were never dependent but simply discerning, if your presence was not availability but choice. This is when fear enters. Not fear of you returning, fear that you won't. Because return would restore the old order. Return would allow apology, negotiation, rebalancing. Return would make the loss temporary. But permanence rewrites hierarchy. If you can leave without looking back, then the relationship was never anchored in your need. It was anchored in their assumption. And assumptions, once shattered, do not reform easily. This is where they test the void. A message sent casually, a reaction to a post, an indirect signal through someone else, not to reconnect fully, to check if the door still exists. And if there is no response, something final settles in. You are not waiting. You are gone. At this stage, the mind attempts one last maneuver: rationalization through morality. They tell themselves that disappearing without explanation is cruel, that silence is immature, that closure is the right thing to offer. But this argument is not about ethics. It's about control. Closure is not kindness. Closure is permission to move on without accountability. It ties a bow around discomfort and places responsibility outside the self. When you deny closure, you deny them that relief. Machiavelli would recognize this immediately. He understood that mercy given at the wrong moment strengthens the other side, and silence, when intentional, is not cruelty. It is boundary. By offering no final conversation, no emotional exit interview, you remove yourself from their internal negotiation. There is no final word to reinterpret, no explanation to dissect, no apology to dilute the impact. You become unanswerable, and that is where the transformation completes. They will not admit this out loud. Pride prevents it. Narrative requires them to appear unaffected. But internally, your absence has done something irreversible. It has forced them to confront their own valuation system. Not everyone grows from this. Many repeat the cycle. They find someone new, someone accessible, someone patient, someone who fills the role you once held. And for a while, it works. Until it doesn't. Because patterns persist, but for a small percentage, something different happens. The mirror doesn't disappear. It stays. And over time, it begins to reshape behavior. Awareness forms. Limits are reconsidered. Entitlement weakens. You will never see this. And that is the final irony. Your absence may catalyze a change you will never benefit from. But that change was never the point. The point was this: by disappearing, you reclaimed sovereignty over your attention, your energy, your emotional economy. You stopped investing in dead stock. You withdrew from a system that undervalued you and reinvested in yourself. The first days were uncomfortable. Silence feels wrong when you've been conditioned to explain yourself. Doubt creeps in. Second-guessing tempts you. You wonder if you were too harsh, if you should reach out, if you should soften the edge. This is the final test. Machiavelli did not teach aggression. He taught strategy. And strategy sometimes means knowing when to leave the board entirely. Not to win the game, but to end it. Because the person who can walk away and stay away holds all the power. Not because they are cold, not because they don't feel, but because they have learned the hardest lesson there is. You cannot force someone to value you, but you can remove yourself from those who don't. And in that removal, something quiet and permanent shifts inside you. A door closes, a chapter ends, and in the space that opens, you discover a different kind of power, not dominance over others, command over yourself. One final part remains. The moment where this understanding stops being intellectual and becomes lived. The moment where absence is no longer a tactic, but an identity. At some point, absence stops feeling like something you're doing and starts feeling like who you are becoming. This is the quiet transition most people never notice, but it's the most important one, because now the silence is no longer about them. It's about you. When you first disappeared, the silence felt active, intentional, almost tense. You were aware of it every day. You noticed the space where messages used to be, the gap where attention once flowed outward. But over time, something shifts. The silence settles. It stops echoing. It becomes neutral. And that neutrality is power. Machiavelli understood that true control is not reactive. It is positional. When you stop orienting your actions around someone else's responses, you regain your center. Your energy no longer leaks outward in anticipation, explanation, or emotional labor. It consolidates. You begin to notice how much effort you used to spend maintaining access, staying reachable, staying agreeable, staying available. You told yourself it was connection, it was loyalty, it was being good, but in hindsight, you see the truth. It was maintenance, and maintenance is expensive. As the silence continues, something unexpected happens. Your mind clears. Not all at once. Gradually. You begin to hear your own thoughts again without interference. Your decisions feel less urgent, less defensive. You stop asking how things will be received and start asking whether they align. This is the reclaiming of internal authority. Machiavelli wrote that a ruler who cannot govern himself will inevitably be governed by others. And for the first time, you realize how often your behavior was being shaped by invisible expectations, by the fear of disappointing, by the discomfort of not responding, by the need to be understood. Those pressures dissolve in absence. You no longer feel compelled to explain your silence, and that's critical. Because explanation is submission. It implies that access to you is a right rather than a privilege. As days turn into weeks, the urge to justify fades. You stop rehearsing imaginary conversations. You stop preparing defenses. You stop trying to control narratives you're no longer part of. People may misinterpret your disappearance. They will fill the silence with their own meanings. Cold, arrogant, changed, unfair. But this no longer disturbs you the way it once might have, because something deeper has anchored. You understand now that perception is not something you can manage without sacrificing yourself. Machiavelli was clear on this. It is better to be respected than to be constantly explained. And respect does not come from accessibility. It comes from boundaries. Your absence becomes a line drawn without words. And lines, once drawn, reorganize everything around them. You notice it in new interactions. You no longer rush to fill space. You don't overextend. You don't volunteer your emotional resources prematurely. You listen longer. You speak less. And when you do speak, your words carry weight because they are no longer compensating for insecurity. This is not detachment in the sense of indifference. It is selectivity. Machiavelli would recognize this immediately. He believed that indiscriminate generosity weakens authority, not because generosity is wrong, but because power requires discretion. When everyone has access, no one feels consequence. You now understand this at a visceral level. Your time feels denser. Your attention more guarded. Your presence, when offered, is intentional. And because it is intentional, it lands differently. You also begin to recognize patterns you once ignored, who respected your boundaries, who only valued your availability, who mistook your patience for permission. Absence has sharpened your perception. It has taught you what presence never could. This is where the old version of you quietly dissolves. The one who overgave. The one who stayed too long. The one who believed that loyalty required self-erasure. There is no dramatic death. No announcement. Just a gradual shedding. Machiavelli would call this evolution through withdrawal. The understanding that sometimes the most strategic move is not engagement, but removal. You are no longer reacting to neglect. You are no longer correcting disrespect. You are no longer seeking acknowledgement. You are operating from choice, and that choice creates asymmetry. People sense it, even if they can't articulate it. Your calm is different now. Your silence is not tentative. It is settled. When you step away, it does not feel like punishment. It feels like conclusion. This is when absence stops being a weapon and becomes a state. You are not waiting for messages. You are not hoping for understanding. You are not monitoring reactions. Your life begins to fill with other things, things that require your full presence. Work, growth, solitude, creation. And in that fullness, the absence becomes invisible to you. But not to them. They may still think of you, still wonder, still feel the occasional echo, but that is no longer relevant, because the power has fully transferred. You are no longer defined by how you are remembered. You are defined by how you move forward. This is the quiet victory Machiavelli spoke of, not the conquest of others, but the conquest of dependency. The moment you realize that needing less gives you more. One final realization remains, the one that transforms this from strategy into philosophy, from tactic into identity, the understanding that absence, when chosen, is not emptiness, it is authorship, and that is where everything resolves. At the end of all of this, there is a realization that doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself with triumph or closure. It arrives quietly, almost indifferently, and that's how you know it's real. You understand now that disappearance was never about punishment. It was about authorship. For most of your life, you were reacting inside stories written by other people, expectations, roles, silent contracts you never agreed to but felt obligated to honor. You showed up because it was assumed you would. You explained yourself because silence felt rude. You stayed because leaving felt like failure. Absence shattered that script, and once it broke, you saw something unsettling. How much of your identity had been built around being accessible, understandable, reliable to everyone but yourself? When you disappeared, that identity lost its oxygen, and what remained was not emptiness, but clarity. Machiavelli understood this with brutal precision. He knew that the most dangerous person in any system is the one who no longer needs approval to act, not because they are reckless, but because they are no longer predictable. Predictability is what allows others to position you. When you are always available, others plan around you. When you always explain, others wait for justification. When you always stay, others assume endurance. But when you remove yourself, cleanly, quietly, without spectacle, you disrupt the structure entirely. And disruption forces respect. Not admiration, not affection, respect. Because respect is born from limits, from uncertainty, from the awareness that access is not guaranteed. That presence is a choice, not a default. By disappearing, you taught a lesson without teaching. You drew a boundary without drawing a line. You closed a chapter without giving it a final paragraph. And in doing so, you reclaimed something most people never do: control over your inner economy. Your attention is no longer reactive. Your energy is no longer drained by people who mistake familiarity for entitlement. Your silence is no longer filled with guilt. It is filled with intention. This is the moment where the fear of being forgotten dissolves. Because you realize something fundamental. Being remembered was never the goal. Being sovereign was. Machiavelli never cared about being liked. He cared about positioning, about leverage, about understanding that power does not always manifest as force. Sometimes it manifests as absence so complete that it forces others to confront their own assumptions. You no longer need to prove your worth. You've stepped out of the marketplace entirely. Your value is no longer negotiated through effort or explanation. It exists independently of recognition. That is freedom, and freedom changes how you move. You speak less, not because you have nothing to say, but because your words no longer chase outcomes. You listen more. You choose more carefully where you invest. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy or availability with loyalty. You also accept something difficult but necessary. Not everyone deserves closure. Closure is a privilege. It is earned through mutual respect, not demanded through habit. When someone consistently ignores your boundaries, your needs, your value, the most honest response is removal, not explanation. This is not cruelty. This is correction, and correction is often silent. In time, people may reach out. Weeks, months, years. A message, a signal, an indirect attempt to reopen a door they assumed would always be there. When that happens, you will feel no rush, because you are no longer deciding from fear. You will decide from alignment. Machiavelli would say this is the highest form of power, the ability to choose without pressure, to respond without compulsion, to remain unmoved by attempts to reassert old dynamics. You are no longer a role in someone else's life. You are the author of your own. Absence taught you that, not as a tactic, but as a truth, and once that truth settles, you don't disappear anymore. You simply become unreachable to anything that cannot meet you where you stand. That is not loss, that is command.